Welcome to Therapy Explained, where we explain, demystify, and destigmatize mental health and mental health treatment. My name is Deniss. I'm a licensed therapist, group practice owner, and your host here at Therapy Explained. So a few weeks ago now, I posted a sticker on my Instagram asking if you have any questions about boundaries, and I love talking about boundaries. And so a few of you submitted some questions on like setting boundaries and just the overall general topic of boundaries, and today I'm going to be answering some of those questions here on YouTube as well. Before we jump into them, as always, be sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already for more videos on all things mental health, and be sure to give it a thumbs up if you find it useful, if you feel like you've learned something, or if you were at the very least entertained by some of my answers regarding boundaries today. And if you want to also submit some questions, be sure to follow me on Instagram. Every so often I'll post up a sticker to see if there's any questions that I haven't answered or things that you might be curious about in regards to mental health. And I really like having the opportunity to kind of just like sit back and just answer questions. So if you want to engage in that with me or participate in some of that, be sure to follow me on Instagram. I'll probably be putting up a sticker sometime soon. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and just jump straight into the video. The first question that we got on boundaries was how to teach people with low self-esteem to get some. So I think a lot of what comes up for us when we have low self-esteem is we're struggling with being able to find the words for those boundaries. We're scared that when we try to set those boundaries that there will be some pushback, and then we kind of walk back our boundaries, right? Or altogether do away with our boundaries because it can be so overwhelming and scary. Now, it is kind of easy for us to go to, well, it's my low self-esteem. That probably is where it's starting from. And of course, as always, I'm going to say therapy is probably a good place to go work through some of this, but what can help is having a perspective of baby steps when it comes to boundaries, right? Really being patient with yourself and understanding maybe where you're at in your journey to boundaries, and not going from I'm really scared to set any boundaries to I'm going to start saying no to, the more difficult people in my life, like my parents or my partner or my boss at work, right? Like that's really overwhelming. So if that's really hard for you to do, come back here to where you're at and ask yourself, what feels doable to me? What can feel easy for me maybe? What kind of stress, what kind of anxiety can I maybe tolerate as I'm practicing my boundaries? And stop there. And once that starts to feel a little bit comfortable, push a little bit more, and then stay there until it starts to feel good, and then keep going, right? So really the idea of baby steps can be helpful for us when we're struggling with that. I do have a video, actually should be published by now, on baby steps for boundaries. So what you can start doing like today to get you started on that journey and taking some steps towards that. So be sure to check that video out if you haven't already. Next question is, what causes people to struggle with maintaining boundaries? Is it always a negative thing? I think, again, it comes back to what our understanding of boundaries is. From my work in individual therapy and also in the workshops that I lead, I do a lot of workshops about boundaries in the workplace. What tends to come up is this overwhelming sense of guilt, right? And that fear of what other people might think of us, or what the repercussions or consequences will be of setting these boundaries. And then the next level of that is like, what do we do with that, right? So if we set a boundary, that alone can be scary. And then if we get pushback or a negative response to our boundaries, that makes it even harder. So from my experience, this is usually what comes up. It's the anxiety, and it's the result of doing these things. And the way that I like to kind of, one of my many metaphors for boundaries is that, like a relationship is kind of like a tandem bike, right? It's two people riding this bike, those two people bikes. And we have this rhythm, right, with this other person, whether that's like, I prioritize you, I say yes to you, I give you my time, right? Like we have this rhythm. And when we try to set boundaries, it's us changing the rhythm, right? And usually it's us slowing it down, right? Or maybe the other person kind of has been coasting and we're the ones who have been pedaling this whole time, and we start to slow down a little bit. There might be this feeling of like, whoa, hold on a second. There's this kind of like jolt, right? And disorienting, because you're changing the pace of something, more likely something that's been steady for a long time. And so you're going to have some reaction from people. Like it's just normal because you're changing the dynamic, right? The previously kind of agreed upon dynamic. And that isn't a bad thing. It's just a change. Everyone has response to changes. And so sometimes when people have negative responses, it will discourage us from maintaining them. But I say all that to say that it's normal for people to have a response, but it doesn't mean that your boundary is wrong or you wanting to do this is a bad thing. Which I guess leads me to the second part of this question, which is it a bad thing that we can't maintain boundaries? And I think, just in general, the kind of person and the kind of therapist that I am, I really try to stay away from words like good or bad. I would really encourage you to reframe some of these questions that you're asking yourself and instead say, is it helpful? Does it feel good? Is this something that I want? Not good or bad, because there really is no such thing, right? It's really up to you. And a more powerful and productive question is that, like, does this feel good to me? Is this helpful? Because sometimes, we might set a boundary based on what other people say is a healthy boundary, right? Or a good boundary. And again, the question is, what's going to feel good to you, right? What is a boundary that you need for your life and your relationships? Because not everybody's relationships are the same. So that would be my answer to that piece. Next one is, what are some healthy boundaries to have with family members? So this question, and again, I promise I'm not trying to be annoying, but again, the answer really is whatever healthy feels to you, right? Whatever would feel healthy to you is the answer. I have boundaries with my family that help me feel safe in my relationship with my families, that with certain family members help me also feel loved and seen. And those are my boundaries, right? And it's taken me time to explore and to figure that out. But that doesn't mean that that's the boundary that you need. Some people choose to completely cut off certain family members, and that is the healthiest thing for them. And other people don't find it necessary to do that and are able to set boundaries that help them feel safe in those relationships without cutting somebody off completely. The one thing that I do see, especially for BIPOC adults, is a difficulty with being able to differentiate ourselves from our family, right? To really see ourselves as a separate being, a separate entity from our family unit. And this kind of gets us into the conversation of enmeshment. I do have a video on it if you want to go ahead and check that video out. But it is this idea that we're like one person, right? And that we have this one identity. Everybody likes the same things, the same hobby, the same music, has the same habits, has the same values, and has the same goals. It's like everybody's one person, right? And if one person's unhappy, then it's going to change the mood of the whole unit. And when we talk about boundaries, some of that will include giving ourselves the permission to be separate from our family, and knowing that because we have a separate identity from our family, doesn't mean that we're not a part of it or that we don't love our family. Two things can be true at the same time, right? You probably heard this too. Many things can be true at the same time. And so in terms of boundaries and what that will look like in detail, it will be up to you. I hope that doesn't feel too therapist-y, whatever you'd like, but it really truly is so individual. And that's also what's going to allow you to keep your boundaries if you listen to your body, right? To what is feeling good to you and not to what other people are telling you is what the boundary should be. Can boundaries be too restrictive that they hinder growth? I think this takes me back to the definition of boundaries and that there's many misconceptions about boundaries. And don't worry, I'm going to be doing a video on that too. But I think this goes back to misconceptions on boundaries, which is the idea that boundaries are walls, right? It's walls that we set up with people, and sometimes it can be too restrictive and keep us from creating connections with other people. And the way that I like to talk about boundaries, the kind that are the most helpful, is they're more like bridges, right? Boundaries are delineated paths, right, that help us feel connected to others. So if you're an island and I'm an island and we build this bridge, right, building this boundary, I'm communicating to you, hey, if you want access to this certain part of me, here's how to do it, right? Here's what's going to feel safe for me so that I can give of myself to you, right? Whether that's like, you know, if you want to have a friendship with me, right? If you want to have access to that part of me, where we like spend a lot of time together and I listen and I pick up your phone calls when you're having a difficult time, I need you to text me first, right? Before you give me that phone call, or I'll be available for those things like on the weekends and on the evenings. Like this is how to have a friendship with me, right? And if you want to maybe have a more romantic relationship with me, here's what I need, right? These are the things that will be helpful for me to help me feel safe in this relationship. So that's what boundaries are. Sometimes it can be triggering for us, and we'll have that reaction of like completely shutting people out, and having no room for people to make mistakes and for us to negotiate a relationship, because relationships really are so much of like experimenting, figuring out what works for me, what works for you, and you know, are these needs compatible, right? Are these behaviors, dreams, wishes, values, you know, identities compatible ultimately? And the idea of boundaries is to facilitate that, right? To create those bridges and those paths to get there. Okay, so I hope that those pieces were helpful in our conversation about boundaries. Again, I think a lot of this really requires us to have a really good understanding of boundaries, and then also allowing for people to like make mistakes and for us to navigate really what our boundaries are going to be like. They're all a journey, and I know it sounds cheesy. So many therapists say that, but it's for a reason. Right? I promise it really is, because we don't have boundaries usually, right? Or that many. Actually, most of us have boundaries without even realizing it. But we're not used to like that reflection piece, establishing new boundaries. That's completely new, and so being able to get to that place where you're confidently expressing your boundaries, knowing what they are, means that you have to explore even like what it is that you need, right? What are your needs? What feels uncomfortable? What feels painful? How are you going to communicate that to people? Finding the words that feel natural to you so that it doesn't feel robotic or like a therapist, right? When you do this, this is how I feel. You learn that in the beginning because you don't really have the words for it yet. And so your therapist might teach you that way to get you into the habit, but eventually you'll find your own words and you'll find a way that feels like really genuine to you and authentic and comfortable for you. That is also a journey. Then learning how to communicate that to people, that is also a journey, because it's anxiety inducing and really difficult. And then once you get that down, you might have negative responses from certain people. You might lose people. That requires grief work. That requires learning to cope. That requires learning to sit in discomfort. And then once that's done, maintaining it and practicing that and establishing it with different relationships and in different places. It's a journey. It really is. That's what I mean by that. And it takes experimentation. It takes trying different things and figuring out what does feel comfortable and what doesn't. And this is also why it can be helpful to have a therapist, because you're working with someone who also gets to know who you are. It can help guide you, like, okay, how did that feel? How about we try this, right? Based on the experience that your therapist might have on that piece. And can be very useful. And if you're interested in getting a therapist and you don't already have one, be sure to check out some of the resources I have down below, some of my favorite directories if you want to find one. So go ahead and check those out. And if you already have a therapist, this might be something that you want to bring up to them, and you want their help in setting some boundaries, go ahead and do so. They're probably more than happy to help you figure that piece out. Well, I hope that today's video was helpful. If it was, be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you enjoyed it, be sure to follow me on Instagram if you want to submit some questions for the next video, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.